classified documents, they've been in the news a lot lately, that phrase, given Donald Trump's propensity to hoard them for God knows what reason, and then even more problematically, refusing to return them. But we also then learn, okay, Biden has some laying around. So does Mike Pence. And it begs the question, right? How many damn documents are classified and why?
Well, the short answer is nobody knows. There's an office in the government that you probably never heard of. Their job is to tell the rest of us, how many times officials are classifying information. But 5 years ago, they gave up and they said they can no longer even guesstimate, how many times every year officials are classifying this or that record. But the last time they tried, it was over 50 million times a year. So yeah, there's just tons of this stuff lying all over the place.
And it just seems like there's very little oversight in that process. What classifies as a classified document, what doesn't. I mean, like, how much of this is essentially, in your opinion, just a best practice for government officials to get away with whatever they want to get away with? And it's become so widespread that there isn't even a thought associated with classifying anything anymore.
Yeah, well, there are rules. These are the rules that presidents issue. They issue executive orders. And according to these rules, they're supposed to only classify information when it can otherwise endanger national security. But as you can well imagine, when they're doing this like tens of millions of times every year, and when there are literally millions of people who have security clearances, you can imagine that all kinds of people are classifying information for their own secret reasons. But, the thing that really bothers me, about, when Trump walked off with boxes and boxes of these documents, it's really about not so much national security, it's about democratic accountability. Because the whole point of preserving those kinds of materials and making sure they're kept in the National Archives so that the rest of us eventually get to see them is so that we can hold our leaders to account. So if they're walking off with these records or destroying them, it means that even the court of history is closed.
Yeah, and from your perspective, I know that you've been working really hard to get some more sunlight on these kinds of things. I mean, just from a researching perspective, what has that process been like, trying to, through FOIA requests and other means, get a handle on just the scope of these classified documents?
Yeah, so what my colleagues and I have been doing at Columbia is that we've been trying to aggregate, the millions of documents that have been declassified, and then we're using data science tools to figure out what's missing. And so, when, at some point in the future, one would hope you could begin looking back, at what documents have been preserved, say from the Trump years, you can begin to see, what's missing, right? Because sometimes like the missing documents, they leave suspicious patterns. And so, the book I wrote, The Declassification Engine, you can see, for example, during the time that Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, there are periods like whole weeks where almost no diplomatic cables are accessible. Almost none of them have been preserved. And the people at the National Archives will tell you that they never got an explanation from the State Department as to why that part of our national history is just gone.
I want to get to that period of history for sure, because World War II and then the Cold War is really, as you write, when this seismic shift begins to happen. But let's just back up really to the creation of the United States Constitutional Convention. Like, what were the systems or lack thereof? What was the collective mindset, if there was any, about classification and secrecy at the founding of the country? And you write about guys like Jefferson and Jackson as well.
Yeah. So, if you read the Constitution, you find that there's actually only one place where they explicitly allow for our government keeping information from us. And interestingly, it's not the executive branch. It's really only Congress, in the Constitution that has a recognized authority, to at least keep some of its deliberations secret. But at the same time, in the Federalist Papers, some of the people you just mentioned, people like Hamilton, Madison, and so on, they also said that the president was going to have to at some times act with secrecy and dispatch, right? And I think most Americans, flash forward a couple hundred years, we would recognize that there are things, whether they're about international negotiations or secret military technology, there are times and places when it's important that our elected leaders do have the power, to keep at least some information for some time, secret from us and especially from our enemies. But what's happened in the meantime is that, this complex that began in the Second World War, it just grew and grew to the point where it's grown completely out of control, to the point where even presidents can no longer keep it under wraps.
Right. And I mean, talk a bit about the how when secrets were kept earlier on, it was more related to keeping information out of the hands of essentially non-white men. Like you talk about how in particular this related to the treatment of indigenous Americans or Black Americans early on in our country's history.
Yeah, so for the first 150 years of our history, the U.S. was really an outlier. We didn't have a central intelligence agency. We didn't have like a black chamber to intercept communications and decode them, as like every other even middling power did at the time. And so, in that way, the U.S. was an outlier and actually at the forefront, right, in advancing principles of democratic government and accountability. But of course, as we also know, at the time, for much of this time, the only people who really were free of state surveillance were white male property owners, and others, especially Black people and women too, were often excluded, even from learning how to read, even having the rudiments, to know what the government was doing. And without that, of course, you can't keep anyone accountable. And so, part of the story, of America, I would say, is that over this period of time, gradually, the scope of who, counted as citizens and had equal, liberties to hold their leaders to account, that gradually expanded over time. But when you get to, the point in World War II, when this new thing, at least new in American history, this apparatus, for keeping a growing amount of information from the American people, when you look at like who it was who first created this system and how they policed its boundaries, what you find is it was basically white men who protected, this last part of our government, and made certain that it was very difficult for anybody who wasn't like them, to get access to it. And the way they did that was through things like security clearances and deciding who had a need to know, top secrets about our government.
Yeah, it's a gradual kind of building up of like certain gatekeeping elements that now we've just completely naturalized. But when it gets starts to go on steroids, I guess, is, as you write, during World War II, when transparency really kind of became a bygone era, particularly for the federal government.
Yeah, and in the years that followed, some people now I think might be surprised, like gender non-conforming people, large numbers of them were able to work in the federal government. Many of them had responsible positions, like in the State Department, for example. And actually, it was after World War II that these people were systematically like hunted down and fired. Right. I mean, so there was actually a crackdown where even the limited diversity that was possible at that time was greatly narrowed. Now, right up to the present day, it's notorious, that the national security state, when we're talking, for example, about the Pentagon or our 18 different intelligence agencies, it's notorious that, especially at the most senior level, these are the least diverse parts of our government. And it's still the case, that when trying to get security clearances, even to be qualified to do the kind of work, the secret work that they do, things like a bad credit rating, any kind of history of an arrest, any admission, of using illicit drugs.
Smoking pot, you still can't get a security clearance. It's ridiculous.
There are all kinds of like structural reasons why, large parts of the American society is more or less excluded.
Yeah.
From even participating in working in national security.
Yeah, that was one of my sweet mom's reaction when I got arrested for smoking weed this one time. She was like, "You can't work in the government now." I'm like, "I don't know if I wanted to." So there's that. There's that.
The CIA may not be right for you, Emma.
I don't think so. But it just like that is so interesting too, especially given like this right-wing campaign right now to say that wokeness is invading the CIA, which is just hilarious. It's a PR exercise for them to bring more kinds of people in because it's important for these institutions to evolve with changing times so that they can maintain the equilibrium that allows them to, say, classify everything all the time.
Yeah, that's the complaint. You actually have people who have been at the CIA for decades, like publicly, writing articles saying that, oh, wokeness is taking over the CIA and it's making it impossible for us to do our mission. But what you find, like as I did, my colleague and I, Pat Irvin, we've been doing research. We're going to be writing up a report on what we found in interviewing people, who have worked in government, in many cases, Black people, women, et cetera, to talk about their experiences. And what they'll say is that, political correctness, DEI sessions, like do nothing for them, right? What really matters in terms of whether, the intelligence community or the Pentagon at its leadership ranks, whether it resembles the rest of America, what matters, of course, is whether people have opportunities to advance, like whether they get mentored and supported. But unfortunately, like when you go back and you look at how, all this began, and the fact that no one like that ever had an opportunity when we're talking about the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there's a path dependence, that plays out over decades, where the people hired then who are in senior positions now, they came of age at a time in which, these, for example, the FBI didn't have a single woman agent.
Yeah.
Not one Black person was allowed to be an FBI agent. Only the people who were J. Edgar Hoover's personal servants, qualified as agents if you were
and
Black.
Eventually informants, right? I mean, and eventually informants for that purpose. Only when they became useful to infiltrating civil rights groups, then and then we can have some Black people in our institution.
And the FBI, these are the gatekeepers of the national security state. Like typically, if you want to get a security clearance, these are the people who are going to interview you, your friends, your relatives, your employers, et cetera. So just think what that means. In the FBI, that kind of institutional culture is what's guarding the gates and deciding who gets to make national security policy in the US.
Right.